got what it takes. So tell me why can't this be love?
Hello everybody, welcome to chapter 4 of Rob Bell's book, Love Wins. This is Justin Spurlock and my name is Steve Poos-Benson. And it is great to welcome you to this conversation with CUC Global. This is an interesting chapter of Rob Bell's book that both Justin and I have a lot of struggle with, because we think Bell walks himself into a conundrum that he does not know how to get himself out of. So what we're going to do is we're going to present to you kind of a basic quick overview of what is going on in the chapter, and then we're going to conclude with what we think are Bell's problems and propose some solutions. So let's just dive into the conversation. The first thing that Bell talks about is that God is an overpowering force that is moving throughout all creation. And the title of the chapter is, Does God Get What God Wants? And so he opens up by saying, well, of course God is going to get what God wants because God is this huge force. And he brings up many passages especially from the Hebrew Scriptures as well as from the New Testament, where he presents God's power, God's force. And as I was reading the chapter, it reminded me of a book by Leslie Weatherhead, The Will of God, where Weatherhead talks about God's will, instead of being a judgment that is handed down on people, instead is this force that moves throughout our lives from before we were born with an intentional will, and then God works in the circumstances of our lives to the circumstantial will, and then God is going to keep on working until God's ultimate hopes and desires for our lives are realized. And I think that's kind of what Rob is working with. But then he introduces a whole nother challenge within this chapter, and that is human agency and human free will. Just why don't you describe that?
Well, Bell's real big premise is that God, since God is love and love ultimately wins, God's love extends to the fact that even humanity in our choices, God will honor our choices, our free will essentially, no matter what. So whether it's in this life or in the afterlife, God's love is going to extend out so that God honors our free choices. So if we choose to accept God, great. If we choose to reject God, God's going to honor that as well. Problem is, we get into the afterlife issues. And does God honor us even in our afterlife? And what happens to us if even in the afterlife we reject God? And do we even have that opportunity in the afterlife to reject God?
And Bell talks about that there are some people within Christendom who believe that no, we only have this life, this living and breathing life, to really accept and affirm God's love. And if we don't accept and affirm God's love in this life and we die without rejecting it, well then it's too late. Like this past week I saw a funny bumper sticker that said, the problem with people who wait until the 11th hour to turn to God's love is that they usually then die at 10:30, and which I thought was kind of funny. But Bell's problem is, he says, well, what about those people who really wanted to accept God but couldn't, and then they die? He said, is God really going to reject them? And that's where he raises this whole issue of God working in the afterlife, which I thought was interesting, kind of funky, because then he kind of ends the book by saying, well, it's not really a question as does God get what God wants, but do we get what we want? And he said, well, that's really the most interesting question. He said, because since love wins, he said that God is going to grant people the permission to reject God. If they want to reject God now and in the afterlife, then God is going to reject that, because God's love equates freedom. And if there is freedom, then God is going to give you the freedom to reject God's love. And then he kind of ends the book by saying, and well, that's it, folks. Let's go on to chapter 5. And I was going, whoa, wait a minute. He's introduced some issues that he doesn't know how to resolve. So Justin, talk for a minute about the whole notion of do we get what we want?
Well, yeah, Bell brings up this at the end. At the beginning he opens the chapter up with, does God get what God wants? He kind of goes on and on and on. He even gets in some rabbit trails with it. And then he goes, well, that's not really the main question. The primary question is, do we get what we want? And he assumes, because of his free will thing, that yes, of course we get what we want. But Steve, I would challenge Rob Bell. I'd come back at him and say, I don't get what I want all of the time, whether it's with my wife or with my parents or with my children or with whatever relationship I am in. I don't get what I want all the time. And I would say God doesn't always get what God wants. And so I think Bell's question is a little it's a little restrained by his own theological viewpoint, coming from more of an evangelical, even fundamentalist background. What do you think about that?
Well, I think what's interesting is God doesn't get what God wants. And I would agree with that because God gave us free will.
Right.
And what's interesting is that Rob Bell is working from an evangelical perspective, and Justin and I were talking before we cut this video that we both kind of work from what is called a process-oriented perspective of who and what God is. And the assumption that we have is that God is not going to get what God wants because God is working with us.
Yes.
And God is working with my will and my desire, and that together we are co-creating the universe. And God has to work with us because God has given us a say-so in the creation. And we're going to choose against God's will. And that doesn't freak God out because we've chosen against God's will. God is going to then come around behind us with every decision that we make. And somehow, through the agency of our work and God's work, God's ultimate will is going to be worked out. So it's not that God is coercive in trying to bend us around towards our free will. It's not that God is going to overcome our free will, but it's more that God is going to work with our free will, and together there's an ultimate creation that is going to be designed.
Yes.
So how would you critique the chapter?
Well, I think Bell gets into, he's really trying to maintain scriptural authority, which is really important in an evangelical fundamentalist viewpoint. And he's trying to maintain that while also trying to challenge all these traditional, considered to be orthodox viewpoints. And so he gets in this little conundrum and tension between those two things. And really what I want to push back on Bell is that, one, sure, love wins. Love is going to, of course, win. People don't reject God. You know, they may have events and decisions in their lives that seem to reject the things of God, but people don't ultimately reject God and love and grace. People just don't reject those sort of things when they're so overwhelming and given a different event, especially thinking about the afterlife and what that may or may not look like. I think to assume that people are going to reject God even then is a little too fanciful for my nature. So
Good,
yeah.
good. So there are three questions that we want you to wrestle with. I'd like to see how you critique this chapter. Justin, why don't you walk people through the questions?
Our first question here is God's power so great that it's coercive? And this kind of gets back to that traditional question about if God is all-powerful, what does it mean if God is all-powerful? And what is that power and how does it work in the world? And Bell really introduces this idea. It's really God's power is God's love, which I think is a great concept. It's a wonderful concept. It's very big in process theology, which Steve and I really have affinities for. But I think this is a great question for us to ask, is what is your own experience of God's power, and how would you categorize it?
Second question is, does God have the ability to work in the afterlife? This was a major theme in the chapter. What is your concept of that? Do you think that if people have, quote-unquote, rejected God in this life, and they die, and they go before God, do you think God continues to work on that soul until that soul embraces God? There's all kinds of problems with that, but I'd like to see your answer on that. Last question.
Last question comes from this whole idea, do we get what we want? And so we want you to describe a time in your life where you didn't get what you wanted, assuming that free will doesn't always work. You don't always get exactly what you want and choose. When is a time that that's happened with you?
So there are the three questions what we want to encourage you to do. We know that many of you are watching the videos, and that's very cool. You've stopped commenting on what we're wearing. That's very cool. But please go to Columbine United Church's Facebook page, and don't be afraid to post your answers on the Facebook page. We also now have each of the previous videos also up on the Facebook page. On the left-hand side of Facebook, there is a section where there is videos, and you can go right there and click on the previous videos. And let's continue our virtual conversation from CUC Global. Justin and I are glad that you're engaging us. Thank you. We'll see you on Facebook. Take care.